Hello everyone, and welcome back to Isaiah for Mormons. Today we're going to be doing Isaiah 39, which appears to be out of chronological order. It also appears to have some small additions to it, although it's very difficult to know. So the chronology really is a mess for all of this, as you know, and it's very hard to figure out where this is supposed to fall, because there are two things that pretty much blatantly contradict each other in the chapter. The first thing is that Hezekiah still has money in this chapter. If the emissaries that are coming, we'll see this in just a minute, the emissaries that are coming from Babylon to meet with Hezekiah in this chapter, that's the point of this chapter, come to meet with him because he's sick and he recovered. But Hezekiah has no cool things to show them, or at least he shouldn't, because he's already given all that to the king of the Assyrians. So there's some difficulty here. It could be that that little note is just a little gloss, a little later addition, and that this happened way before the Assyrian invasion. Or this could be after the Assyrian invasion, but then how does he have anything to show them? Because he's asked to have to give away everything. He even gave away the stuff in the temple to buy off the Assyrians. So it's difficult to know when this should be placed. We'll talk about it a little bit as we go through it. But the major point is, this is Isaiah telling Hezekiah that Jerusalem is going to be saved in a sort of indirect way. It also condemns Hezekiah a little bit, reasonably so, I think, for kind of his arrogance. I think that's one of the constant things that we have with kings. Kings being a little too big for their own britches, and I think this is something that we see here with Hezekiah. Hezekiah is a great king. He gets a pretty good report card from the historians writing about him, but one can only assume that as a king he has some problems. The Old Testament has a love-hate relationship with kings. They're never going to paint a king as being exclusively good. If you see a king that is exclusively good in the Old Testament, there's probably some editing going on. So let's just dive into it, talk a little bit about Isaiah 39. So it begins, "At that time Merodach-Baladan, the son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent letters and a present to Hezekiah, for he'd heard that he had been sick and was recovered. And Hezekiah was glad of them, and showed them the house of his precious things, the silver and the gold and the spices and the precious ointment, and all the house of his armor, and all that was found in his treasures. There was nothing in his house, nor in all his dominion, that Hezekiah showed them not. Then came Isaiah the prophet unto King Hezekiah, and said unto him, What said these men, and from whence came they unto thee? And Hezekiah said, They are come from a far country unto me, even from Babylon. Then said he, What have they seen in thine house? And Hezekiah answered, All that is in mine house have they seen. There is nothing among my treasures that I have not showed them." So this chapter starts off with a name you may not be familiar with, Merodach-Baladan, the son of Baladan, king of Babylon. So this guy is the quintessential troublemaker for the Assyrians. He's always rebelling and having rebellions put down, trying to mess with the Assyrian Empire. And that's what Hezekiah is doing. So what makes sense to me is that before the siege, Merodach-Baladan has heard maybe rumblings that perhaps Hezekiah is not necessarily going to be terribly loyal to the king. So Merodach-Baladan, who hates the Assyrians as much as Hezekiah does, comes and sends messengers to scope out Hezekiah as an ally. See if maybe they could rebel at around the same time, which they do, by the way, and see if there might be a way to use Hezekiah to help him crush the Assyrians. Hezekiah revolts in the early 700s. It gets invaded right around 701, so he revolts just a little before that. Then this guy appears to be revolting around 702, 703. So he revolts just slightly before Hezekiah, but they're right around the same time. The king of Assyria goes and puts down the revolt of the king of Babylon, this Merodach-Baladan guy. Then he comes over and crushes Hezekiah. And in the process, he may have transported some of the people from Judah to Assyria and then on to Babylon. That's going to be important later. but that would make sense. They tried to shuffle around the population as much as possible to make sure that the empire was homogenized, so that you wouldn't have locals dealing with local loyalties in their own homelands. They'd be shipped far away. And it seems that some people from Judah were put into Babylon. That appears to be the case from indications we're going to talk about later in the Book of Mormon. So this Merodach Baladan guy fights with the Assyrians in roughly 703 to 702. Then, just a year later in 701, Sennacherib invades. And so you have this coming one right after the other. So that's who this guy is. And he may be pretty influential in what ends up happening in the history of Judah. So he comes, presumably he has not heard that he's been sick and was recovered. That may just be a later addition. Probably he's sending these emissaries because he wants Hezekiah's help. So Hezekiah is happy about these emissaries. It says that Hezekiah was glad of them and showed them the house of his precious things. Once again, he would have literally no precious things left. He's had to use everything to buy off the Assyrians, even stuff from the temple. So this probably happened before the invasion. And like I said, that makes the end of this chapter make sense. So before the invasion, he's saying, hey, look, I have a lot of money. I have a lot of resources. I can do this. I can help you. He says he shows him everything. All these really, really precious objects in his whole domain, it says, the entire kingdom. Hezekiah shows them everything to sort of show, I think, yeah, you can have confidence in me. I can really help with this rebellion against the king of Assyria. And this shows, I think, a certain level of arrogance on Hezekiah's part. That he's still feeling like he's going to buy his way out of this one. So this is before really Hezekiah has repented. We see this later on. Hezekiah kind of comes to himself and repents. This is probably before that. Hezekiah is still thinking he can work his way out of this problem himself. Isaiah is continuously kind of making fun of him for that early on. You'll remember that. But here he's still just trying to dig himself out by his own power. And Isaiah is always telling him, only God can help you. Come on, don't be like this. And Hezekiah, you can tell from archaeological evidence, he really is trying to dig himself out of this. Hezekiah has huge, huge amounts of money and resources that he pours into the siege of Jerusalem and trying to defend Jerusalem and trying to defend his kingdom, which is great. It's important for him to do that. But he does this without turning to God, and I think that's the big problem that Isaiah keeps coming down on for. He was having all these huge amounts of resources that he was using to buy supplies. We had these little seals, actually, that used to go on packages of supplies sent to the army. We found them all over Lachish, presumably because he's just sending as much food and resources as he can to the army in Lachish. A whole lot of good it does them. It was eventually taken. But he at least made the effort. And it could be that the impending fall of Lachish is what helped them to sort of get them into gear and repent, because they realized that no amount of throwing money at the problem was going to help them. And that could be what finally gets Hezekiah and the kingdom to kind of come around. So we know that Hezekiah has been sort of throwing money at the problem, and so Hezekiah is in I'm going to make fun of you mode for this, and so he continues here in verse 3. So this is almost certainly before the invasion. So then came Isaiah the prophet to King Hezekiah and said unto him, What said these men, and from whence came they unto thee? So, hey, Hezekiah, who are these guys? And Hezekiah says, Oh, they're from a long ways away. They're come from a far country unto me, even from Babylon. Oh yeah, Babylon, little country a long ways away. Probably never heard of it, kind of a thing. And Hezekiah is utterly unconcerned. He doesn't realize that if the Assyrians can be a big problem, don't you think the Babylonians can be a big problem? They're always causing the Assyrians issues. Don't you think the Babylonians could someday absorb the Assyrians and then come knocking on your door? So Isaiah realizes this. So he says, Then said he, What have they seen in thine house? And Hezekiah answered, All that is in mine house have they seen. There's nothing among my treasures that I have not showed them. Hezekiah says, Well, I gave them the grand tour. I showed them everything. Showed them all my wealth. Showed them how productive the countryside is. So then we get this. Then said Isaiah to Hezekiah, Hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Behold, the days come that all that is in thine house and that which thy fathers have laid up in store until this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, saith the Lord. And of thy sons that shall issue from thee, which thou shalt beget, shall they take away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Then said Hezekiah to Isaiah, Good is the word of the Lord which thou hast spoken. He said, Moreover, for there shall be peace and truth in my days. What? You may be asking yourself, what just happened? Hezekiah seems like the worst human being in the world, and maybe he is at this point in his life. Isaiah is always giving him a tough time about his morals, which are not terribly existent. So, presumably, Hezekiah is very callous. This makes sense to have this response if this is happening before Hezekiah repents. But there's another thing that makes sense about it. Isaiah is saying the Babylonians are going to take the rest of the treasure away. Hezekiah will give a lot of it to the Assyrians, but the rest, and even his own sons, his own descendants, are going to be given to the Babylonians as slaves. And he says, wait a second, if the Babylonians are going to do this, that means I'm going to survive the Assyrian attack. I'm going to be able to rebel against the Assyrians and survive. So that's the way he interprets it. He says, well, that's great. Good is the word of the Lord which thou hast spoken, for there shall be peace and truth in my days. Even if my sons are going to be slaves in the palace of the king of Babylon, it says eunuchs. That's difficult to know if that is eunuch as in eunuch, or eunuch as in just slaves. It's hard to know which is which in the Old Testament. Could be both in this case. It's very difficult to say. But the idea is everything is going to be taken away to Babylon. So he says, okay, good. If it's going to be taken away to Babylon, it means the Assyrians are not going to be able to take it, and I'm going to be spared. So we get this very callous response, but it shows that Hezekiah is going to live through the Assyrian siege. And it could be after this that he begins in earnest to make preparations for the siege. So we see a before and after picture for Hezekiah. Hezekiah, the devout king, who's doing what he's supposed to do. Seeing that? And then this is the before picture. This is the Hezekiah who's just always trying to do stuff his own way and isn't going to listen to God and is just going to do his own thing. And is just constantly trying to do things on his own in his own way. Now, we shouldn't be too hard on Hezekiah, even as a younger guy. I think he was probably a pretty good guy even when he was younger, but he still had a lot of the standard issues, and Isaiah is going to be gunning for him for that. So I think what we see with this story is we're reminded of the fact that people can change. That Hezekiah goes from being pretty rough around the edges to being somebody who has really let the message of Isaiah sink into his heart and is going to do the right thing. So anyway, that's where we are with this. We are here at the end of the historical section, and we dive now into what is called Deutero-Isaiah. Before we go into it, I just want to give you a little reminder of what we're going to be looking at. So most scholars consider Isaiah 1 to 39 to be all by Isaiah. The Book of Mormon would make us say, perhaps chapter 1 is not by Isaiah. Perhaps 2 through about 35 is by Isaiah. 36 to 39 may be by somebody else. 1 is probably by somebody else. And now with 40, we're getting back to Isaiah. So this is where I have to part company with all the major writers of Isaiah commentaries over the years. Pretty much everyone, actually. Because I think that this is talking specifically about the Assyrians. He's continuing to talk about events in his own time. That's what I think. I think 40 through at least 55, he's continuing to talk about events during his own lifetime. Some people will edit that to have it refer to the Babylonians because they're maybe a little bit confused about it. But I think that we're still here talking about Isaiah in his own lifetime. And in fact, chapter 40, we'll talk about it next time, but chapter 40 appears to be a continuation of the speech that started in 34. So it goes 34, 35, and then jumps right on into 40 and goes through the beginning of probably 42 with this long speech he's given after probably Lachish has fallen, but before the Assyrians have come to take out Jerusalem, to get them to be courageous and not be afraid. So I think that's what we're going to see as we proceed here. But you've made it through now what scholars consider Proto-Isaiah, the stuff written by Isaiah himself. I disagree. I think we're going to continue on with stuff Isaiah himself wrote, But we're going to be getting some interesting edits here as we go on. I'm not going to be using the Septuagint quite as much as I have in the past, because I want to demonstrate that the edits are different here. The edits are usually pretty straightforward, and they specifically connect to the Babylonian captivity. People taking Isaiah's words and applying them directly to the Babylonian captivity. Now, without the Book of Mormon, I can't stress this enough, that without the Book of Mormon, there's no way to think that this is the case. We would just assume that Isaiah writes 1 through 39, that somebody else writes 40 through about 55, and somebody else writes 56 to the end. That's very reasonable based on the evidence without the Book of Mormon. But the Book of Mormon changes the picture. So I'm going to go it alone here and try to explain how Isaiah still works. The rest of the book of Isaiah, at least a lot of it, still works in Isaiah's time with the Assyrian captivity. So anyway, that's it for 39. We'll be jumping into 40 soon, and so we will see you guys next time.